They put me on the clearance crew because I had steady hands and nothing left to lose. And that combination is worth more to a labor foreman than any amount of muscle. 7 years into a 14-year sentence, you learn what work keeps you out of the wind and what work gets you noticed for the wrong reasons. Clearing the hangar was the first kind. Nobody wanted to be noticed by the hangar. It sat, cut into the spine of a mountain on Orsk's Reach, a cavity so large that the work lights strung along its rafters looked like a string of dim stars laid sideways across a black sky. 30 centuries, the survey report said, since anything in there had moved on its own. 30 centuries since the row of standing figures along the eastern wall had so much as shifted their weight. Governors had sent envoys. The Academy had sent its best linguists, its best engineers, men with credentials longer than my sentence. They stood in front of those statues and said every word their scholarship could produce, and the statues gave them nothing. Eventually, the Academy stopped sending people, and the convict crews started clearing rubble instead, because rubble was honest work and didn't require permission from anything that might be listening. I'd been on the crew 8 months by the time it happened, and in that time I'd come to know the hangar the way you know a room you've swept 1,000 times. The Sentinels, that's what the guards called them. Though nobody knew if that was right, stood 12 abreast along the eastern wall, each one easily 4 times my height, carved or cast or grown from some dark gray material that didn't take dust the way stone should. Their arms hung at their sides, their heads, faceless save for a long vertical seam, tilted forward slightly, as if they'd all been looking down at something on the floor for 3,000 years and never finished looking. My job that morning was the footing line clearing collapsed scaffold and old marker posts from the base of the wall so the engineers could run ground-penetrating gear along it without snagging their cable. It was slow work. Pry up a fallen post, drag it to the sled, go back for the next one. The posts themselves were nothing pale metal stakes, waist high, spaced every few meters along the wall's foot, the kind of boundary marker you'd find ringing any restricted site in the colonies. Half of them had fallen or rusted through and lay scattered in the dust, like a dropped fence. I want to be honest about what I did next, because there was nothing clever in it. I didn't think about the sentinels at all. I picked up a fallen post, and instead of dragging it straight to the sled, I drove its base back down into its socket hole and turned it until the little ring at the top sat level the way you'd true up a fence post, the way you check it's not leaning, the way you'd want it if cattle or wire or anything at all were going to depend on that line holding straight. It's a habit. My grandfather had it, and he gave it to me the way you give a kid a chore that's really a lesson. Except neither of us ever knew what the lesson was for. He worked perimeter maintenance on a colony agricultural lease for 40 years, walked the boundary line every morning of his life, straightened every post, checked every marker, even the ones nobody had used in decades, even the ones that didn't connect to anything anymore. I used to ask him why we bothered with the dead sections of fence, the ones that just ran out into scrub with nothing on either side. He'd just say, "Because the line's the line, Tomas. You don't get to decide which part of it matters." I thought it was an old man's stubbornness. I did it because he made me, and then I kept doing it because by the time he died it was just something my hands knew how to do, the way some men can't help squaring a picture frame on a wall. So I trued up a 3,000-year-old marker post in a dead alien hangar, out of the same reflex that used to annoy me on a fence line 200 light years from here, and I went to pick up the next one. The light changed before the sound did. It came from the nearest sentinel, not the eyes. There were no eyes, just that long seam down its front, and it came from low, from somewhere around what would be the chest on a man. A line of cyan, thin as a wire, brightening along the seam, and then branching, the way a crack spreads through glass, except this crack was light, and it was spreading upward, outward, across the figure's shoulders and down its arms, picking out a pattern of fine grooves I hadn't known were there, because they'd been the same dead gray as everything else for as long as anyone had looked at them. Every man on that footing line went still. I heard one of the engineers up on the scaffold say something short and disbelieving, and then nothing else, because the Sentinel was moving. It didn't lurch. That's the thing I keep coming back to. There was no violence in it. Nothing of the waking monster you'd brace for. It bent at what I suppose was a knee, slow and deliberate. The kind of slow that comes from something enormous being very careful. And it went down, one knee to the hangar floor, hard enough that I felt it through my boots, soft enough that nothing cracked. Its head, that long seamed slab, tilted down toward me. The cyan light running through the grooves of its face now too. And it raised one arm and opened its hand, palm up, at about the height where I was standing. Nobody on that crew moved. The guards didn't reach for anything. I think we all understood, without anyone saying it, that whatever this was, it wasn't aimed at the room. It was aimed at me, and at the post in my hands, and at the line of trued markers running down the wall behind me that I hadn't even noticed I'd been correcting one at a time for 8 months without anyone telling me to. The voice didn't come from a mouth. It came from the whole frame of it, low enough that I felt it in the post still gripped in my hands. In my sternum, in the floor under my boots, a sound like something enormous, exhaling words it hadn't used in a very long time. Still standing, lost guardian. That was all. 4 words, and then the light didn't fade. It settled, the way a fire settles into coals, banked but alive, running quiet through every groove on that vast gray body, and down the line to the other 11, who did not move, but whose seams now carried the same faint cyan thread. Watching. I didn't understand it then. I want to say I felt the weight of it immediately, that some ancient knowledge unlocked behind my eyes. But that's not how it happened. What happened was that an engineer with the right clearance pulled records nobody had been able to read before because the Sentinels, it turned out, had simply never opened the relevant files to anyone. And over the following weeks, I learned what the ward line had been. Not soldiers, not warriors. A corps of perimeter keepers, assigned in pairs to walk the marker lines that ringed every site the Sentinels were sworn to hold. Because the Sentinels' watch was bound to those lines their authority, their permission to act. All of it ran along that boundary, and a sentinel cannot watch a line it cannot trust is true. The ward line walked those lines for centuries after whatever they were guarding against had passed, long after anyone remembered why, because the order said the line's the line, and you don't get to decide which part of it matters. And then, at some point no record marked, the last of them stopped being called the ward line at all. They were just men who walked fences, men like my grandfather, men like me, until that morning, dragging dead posts to a sled. I finished my sentence. Nobody pardoned me. There was some discussion of it, and I asked them not to, because I didn't want the first thing people knew about me to be a favor. I serve out my time the way I always did, and most days the work is still ordinary. Lifting, carrying, the small, honest tasks that keep a man's hands busy. But every morning before the crew starts, I walk that eastern wall, post to post, and I check that each one is true. The Sentinels don't move when I do it. They don't need to. The light in their seams just runs a little brighter along the line as I pass. 12 sets of eyes that aren't eyes, watching the boundary hold the way it's held for 3,000 years because somewhere, without ever knowing it, somebody kept walking the line. And the line, it turns out, was never the part that mattered least.